Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman. Welcome to Breaking On Today, the Daily, where today we begin with a gaming story. Now, this is interesting because this is my first gaming story on Breaking On the Daily, and I swear I did conceive this show as being at least partially about this sort of story and media stories along with politics, but as you can see from my normal output, didn't end up working out that way for a good bit, mostly because none of the stories were particularly interesting. It's not that I wasn't looking for gaming or media stories, it's just that I didn't really have anything to talk about. But now I actually do, because here's the first headline for today. Scalpers are reselling PS5 and Xbox Series X for over $5,000 on eBay. Now, people are having a whole hissy fit about this, about how, oh, they're all price gouging or whatever, and oh, it's super overpriced, and you have the also requisite screeches of artificial shortages from the companies that are selling these things, Microsoft and Sony. And I don't really have a problem with this. I don't know. My opinion on scalpers is very different from other people because I understand the concept of supply and demand. And what I think a lot of people miss is that predicting how a console will sell is almost impossible. I mean, the amount of sales that a console makes vacillates wildly between generations. I mean, if you want to look at a prime example of such, just look at Nintendo's sales. For the past 4 generations, they've gone from selling like crap to selling like hotcakes to selling like crap to selling like hotcakes. It's gone back and forth 3 times now. And you have a similar thing going on with Xbox and PlayStation, and not to the same extent, but you certainly have a ebb and flow in terms of how much they're actually being sold for. During the 7th generation, Xbox was on top. During the 8th generation, PlayStation was on top. And during this generation, we don't know who will be on top. Yeah, we could expect that it will be Xbox, and I think it will, considering how they've been running things, and they seem to have a tighter ship than PlayStation at this point. But it's up in the air. You don't know until you actually have the product out there what the demand will actually be in reality. No matter how much you do in terms of research, market research, focus groups, and all that sort of thing, you never know until you put it out there. And there's no use in having millions and millions of consoles just sitting in warehouses waiting for them to be useful at some point. You might as well have a underball of how much you expect to actually be sold, and later, ramp up production as you see the actual demand for the product that you're selling. So this is to be expected. I don't see why people have a huge problem with this. I mean, they'll say, well, I want to buy a console at launch, and, $8,000 is prohibitively expensive for me. And at that point, I might ask, should you be buying a console at launch? I think it's been fairly well documented that buying a console at launch is not a very worthwhile investment and won't end up being very useful to most people throughout the rest of the year. So I don't get the concept of buying a console at launch in the first place. And yeah, some of these consoles are obviously exorbitantly priced. They shouldn't be bought by people. But yeah, just don't buy them. I mean, you're not obligated to buy a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X. You can wait, and it's fine to wait. I will wait. I was never planning on buying a console at launch in any respect. I don't buy, as you can see behind me, I play PC gaming majorly, and I have a Switch, which, by the way, I didn't get until like a year after. It was around the time Mario Odyssey came out when I got that thing. It was a bit after the console actually launched, and I knew I actually wanted it. But as you can see, once again, I have a PC. It's a gaming PC. I use it a lot. I have fun. I have fun with the gaming PC. And I have not bought you have a similar thing in PC gaming with, like, graphics cards and that kind of thing. And I have not bought any new generation graphics cards, because you have the same thing you have with consoles. They're generally not worth buying at launch. You might as well buy a last gen thing because all of the prices are going down. Because the new gen stuff, not only do you have the problems of new manufacturing that inevitably show up, you also have driver issues. They're usually overpriced at launch. not even just from Scalpers, but also from, the actual companies. And so, just don't buy a console and watch. I don't get it. On to another story, and this is another tech story, actually. Parler tops App Store charts for the first time. And this is a really good sign for alt tech. You're seeing a lot more momentum get into it than you've ever really seen in alt tech for a long time, especially if you've been in the scene for a while. You remember, like, the VidMe days and that sort of thing. This is certainly the most momentum any alt tech site has ever had. But what I want to talk about more specifically is actually what I see as the problem with most alt tech sites, and that is that they don't really appeal to the sorts of people you want to get on the site. I mean, they appeal to people like me. They appeal to inherently political people, the people who are wanting to get onto an alt tech site. But to get someone like me to go onto an alt tech site is trivially easy. It's trivial. I mean, all you have to do is exist. And I'll probably be putting up my videos on your site. I put up my videos on, 5 sites now? Yeah. I upload my videos everywhere, okay? So, and I use Minds, Parler, Gab, Twitter, all of these sites. It's trivially easy to get me onto your site. And it seems as though most alt tech sites, particularly places like BitChute, have a penchant for only advertising to me. And you can see this evident in any other category other than politics. Because in the politics category, you have videos being posted every day, commentary videos, podcasts, all these sorts of things. Everything you could possibly want for politics, or at least, on the right side of the spectrum, you're going to find it on BitChute. You're going to find it on Brighteon. You're going to find it on Library. You're going to find it in all of these places. But for anything else, if you're looking at things like video game content or, beauty content, something I don't watch, but, something people like, for normal vlogs, non-political vlogs, all those sorts of things, you're not going to find the sort of content you want on a place like BitChute. Just look at their categories. I mean, have you looked at any other category other than politics? Have you looked at their, anime tab, or their film tab, or their gaming tab? You have some stuff, sure, but you certainly don't have a PewDiePie. You don't have any sort of momentum in those areas. Not the same sort of momentum, certainly, that you have in places like the political spectrum, or the political topic. And that's something that really needs to be fixed on these sites. They need to start advertising to the people who would be at least sympathetic to the idea of a separate, non-YouTube site. And I don't think it would be particularly difficult. I mean, why isn't BitChute or Library or Rumble or any of these sites spending a lot of their time not necessarily trying to get, say, PewDiePie to have an exclusive deal with them, but just to get him to upload to their site at all? Because you really wouldn't need an exclusive deal. People are fed up with YouTube, and if they had literally any other option that they felt was legitimate and they felt was viable, they'd use it. But the problem is that even at this point, where alt tech is gaining momentum, it's not gaining momentum in some of the places that it needs to gain momentum. It's only gaining momentum in the political space. It's only gaining momentum in the political context. It's not gaining momentum in terms of its normal non-political content, and it needs that non-political content in order to survive long term. And more importantly, become as big as something like Twitter or something like YouTube. It does need those sorts of people in their sphere. And they need to start advertising to those people. They need to start trying to get those people. And once you have those people, and those people start getting a large enough following, a non-political channel gets a large enough following, you're going to start seeing these alt-tech sites snowball even more than they are now. Inevitably, seeing as how these sorts of topics work. So, that's what I want these platforms to start doing. But certainly, Parler getting number 1 on Apple's App Store is a really good sign. It is a really good sign. They had something like 310,000 downloads over the weekend. Really, it's a good sign. But on to our political stories. We have the Supreme Court to hear challenge to California law allowing aggressive labor recruitment. this is a pretty good sign because for those who don't know, California's labor laws, their union laws, are completely ridiculous. They allow essentially labor activists or union activists to just walk onto someone's property at any time of the day during work hours and essentially proselytize to anyone within earshot with bullhorns and all these sorts of things and make a huge disruption. The specific case that's being argued here was an agricultural issue where I think it was the United Farmers Workers Union. Yeah, the United Farm Workers Union were just walking on to a private strawberry field with bullhorns and all this sort of stuff, and essentially ran a far-left activist protest in the middle of one of the busiest harvest seasons they've had. And, man, it is completely ridiculous what the California law allows them to do this. And it doesn't help that their Board of Labor Relations has interpreted the law to be very broad. And it's also very encouraging that the Supreme Court has taken this up, since we already have a 5-seat majority of conservatives, no, I don't count Roberts, on the Supreme Court. So this is a very good sign, because it's very likely this law will be struck down as being unconstitutional. It's just because the idea that someone could go onto your private property and then not only be on your private property, but proselytize on your private property, cause a disruption, run around yelling with bullhorns, and just generally being a nuisance to the people who are not only working on your private property, but to yourself, is just ridiculous. It's obvious trespassing, but it's legal in California to do that if you have the right people covering you, in this case, a union. This law really needs to be struck down. And I'm going to be watching this story, and if there's any updates on either end, there surely will be when the Supreme Court actually rules on this decision. I will certainly be updating you. On to our next story, though. Governor Cuomo and Trump have been in a sort of catfight, or not a catfight, more like a spitting contest with each other over vaccines. Because anti-vaxxer Governor Cuomo has been saying, well, we're going to do our own tests on the vaccine, and we're not going to trust the Trump administration. And the Trump administration essentially said, well, okay, if you don't want our vaccine, don't take it. And has said, well, if you don't want our vaccine, we're not going to give it to you. Or we're just go away, essentially. And now Cuomo has threatened to sue the Trump administration if the president, does what he said he was going to do. Which I'm not so convinced that he's actually going to do it. Trump is bombastic, but he's a reasonable guy. He'll negotiate with people. He'll negotiate with friggin' anyone if they're willing to negotiate with him, obviously. But it seems to me this is a fun story. It's something that gets you away from all the presidential stuff and all that sort of thing. And it's certainly worth talking about because, man, anti-vaxxer Governor Cuomo has certainly had some ridiculous rhetoric over the past few weeks and months, talking about how he doesn't trust Trump, the Trump administration. He's not going to take the vaccine. You have the same things kind of coming from Kamala Harris and that sort. And so it's funny to see their comeuppance. It's certainly very funny. But also, on to our next story, more COVID-19 news. Biden advisor has been walking back the lockdown rhetoric they've been doing over the past week, saying they don't support another nationwide lockdown. Now, this story is very interesting because essentially the COVID advisor that we're specifically talking about denies the idea that there's going to be a 4 to 6 week lockdown. Personally, I'm of the belief there will be, specifically if the certain people that we've been seeing get into the Biden administration proper, assuming that he actually does become the president. I'm not entirely convinced at this point, but, we'll see. But essentially, this guy's walking it back saying, no, we're going to do local things, and we're not going trample over your First Amendment rights on a federal level because, they get absolutely destroyed in court if they tried. But what you're seeing right now is essentially a scenario where this guy is defending the Trump administration's response, essentially saying, no, we can do localism, we can do federalism. The same thing that Trump was doing, that we were criticizing him for doing literally 2 minutes ago. Jeez. I mean, it's fun to see all of these leftists admit that Trump was right, tacitly through their support of his policies. His support of federalism and that sort of thing. But man, couldn't you have done this a week ago? Couldn't you have done this 2 weeks ago? Couldn't you have been honest? You have this sort of things going on, and man, it's just sad. It's sad to see, that these people have no spine. But we also have more and more stories. Speaker Pelosi has called out Facebook for not censoring people more. Yeah, if it wasn't entirely clear where the left and right stand in terms of the free speech issue, I think it should be entirely clear now. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has openly endorsed censorship and said that Facebook has not censored conservatives enough. Man. I mean, it's fun to see all of these leftist types saying, these billion-dollar corporations, not only should they be allowed to censor whoever they want in violation of their status as platform, they should do it more. They're morally right in doing that. And the funniest thing and the most ridiculous thing I have seen from most people on the left and that sort of thing, they think it's a binary position. Either you believe that the government should be deeply involved with private businesses, and they should control all of these big tech platforms and force them to not censor people, or you have no legitimate complaint, even without a legal complaint, against these platforms for doing what they are doing. This is ridiculous, because the core of libertarianism is that my highest moral standard should not be applied to you. That doesn't mean I don't have moral qualms with people who I don't have legal qualms with. I can say, what Twitter's doing is not illegal, but it's still bad. I can still say that. I can still say the censorship of people is immoral on Twitter's part and not advocate for their takeover by the state. I can still advocate for that. This isn't hard. I don't have the same legal standards that I have moral standards. It would be ridiculous to hold people to the highest moral standard through a legal process. I mean, you'd have to, at that point, say, well, if you lie to people, they have to go to prison, or they have to be fined or whatever, under any circumstances, even if they do it by mistake. I mean, there are moral things that people do all the time that we don't criticize legally. We only criticize in terms of a potentially social or moral sense. We don't criticize it legally. Because there's a difference between legal morality, which is generally concerned with freedom, the rights of people, and more social, higher standards of morality, which are cornered more around things like purpose, things like truthfulness, honesty, fidelity in your actions, that sort of thing, which aren't necessarily things which we should prosecute criminally. That's the sort of thing, that's the sort of separation that is necessary to have a libertarian society. Otherwise, you have an authoritarian society, even tacitly, even if it is socially permissive in its own right. Because what ends up happening is if the culture changes under a fundamentally authoritarian system where the highest standard of morality is applied wholesale to the legal system, what ends up happening is if it becomes less socially permissive, which will inevitably happen, what will end up happening is that it will become illegal for all of these these things which were legal before but are now no longer allowed under the previously socially permissive but now non-socially permissive society. These things will no longer be allowed because it's not a fundamentally libertarian society. It's rather an authoritarian society. and that's just my position on the subject. But next I want to talk about recounts, because Arizona has held the lead in Arizona after all the votes have been tallied in that state. And if there have been calls for recounts and audits and that sort of thing. The Republican Party in Arizona has actually called for an audit and recount. And I want to say, I said something on Friday that I kind of want to take back. And that is, I underestimated the potential effect of recounts. I said, I don't think they're going to flip much. They haven't been shown to flip much in the past. And you know what? I was wrong. Because it turns out recounts have flipped things in the past and have had things like 10,000 votes flip. I mean, I was using that based on Bush v. Gore, where the recounts really didn't flip a whole lot. And the reason in that case was that, well, there wasn't a whole lot of actual error within the Florida election system even at that time, which is why the recounts didn't really do a whole lot. And I mean, they only flipped a few hundred votes, and even at the widest margins, they only flipped a few hundred votes. But this time around, and this has happened in the past as well, where you've had thousands of votes flipped through recounts, but I think that's not so relevant as this time around. We've had thousands of votes flip already. We've shown them to be flipped through recounts already in this election. For instance, this is a Twitter thread I've seen. A recount in New Hampshire for a county legislative seat gave them an additional 380 votes, and the GOP an added 1,600 votes. I mean, this is insane. In New Hampshire alone, you have a scenario where the GOPers have had a average addition in votes of about 6%, whereas the average Democrat change was essentially zero. Oh man, this is just in a few counties in New Hampshire, and you already have thousands of votes being counted for. I think it's about 4,000 or 5,000 total. I mean, it is kind of ridiculous. Apply this to the states where there has been evidence of impropriety. Places like Michigan, places like Wisconsin, places like Pennsylvania, places like Georgia, places like Arizona. Well, apply this to those states and move it up to the whole state and do a full audit and that sort of thing. Had recounts. I mean, you have that sort of thing going on in Georgia now. And you could see potentially hundreds of thousands of votes flip. That's not out of the realm of possibility. I entirely underestimated this potential. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. I thought that wasn't possible at all. But it's looking like that might be the case. I mean, we've already seen certain instances of votes being flipped because of faulty software in terms of Dominion, the 6,000 votes and that sort of thing, which, though it has been claimed that it has been debunked by the New York Times, if you actually read that article, it doesn't debunk the claim. All right, it says it debunks the claim in the headline, but once you actually read it, well, it turns out they don't debunk the claim. They actually support the claim. It's ridiculous. Viva Fry did a good video on this, and I suggest you watch it. But that's the scenario we're at right now, where recounts are much more effective than I ever thought they were. And, this is a good thread. I suggest you read it. It shows some good data, and, it opens up the possibility of certain things happening. I mean, you had a similar thing happen. I think it was in Michigan, where a Republican House candidate ended up winning because, 3,000 votes were flipped to him during a recount, when he had already thought of conceding at that point. I mean, recounts are much more of an issue than I ever expected. So I suggest you watch them, because they might end up being a huge deal. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you today. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.